Hello, good evening. Lovely to see you all here tonight. Thanks so much for coming out on this dreary, cold, freezing cold, I should say, November night. It's great to see you here tonight and great to have an online audience tonight as well. My name is Frances Wilkins. I'm Senior Lecturer here at the Elphinstone Institute in Ethnomusicology. And we're really delighted to have Professor Kwesi Yankah here from Ashesi University in Ghana to speak with us for the annual Buchan Lecture. Before he starts, I'm just going to say a few words about the Institute and what we do. You may have expected to see Tom McCain standing here this evening. Tom usually delivers this introduction. He's actually away on research leave just now, off in Guatemala and the States, so he can't be with us tonight. So I'm stepping into his shoes to say a few words. So first of all, who are we? Some of you will know all of us, and some of you may not know any of us. So I'll just run down who we are. There's obviously myself and Tom McCain. We also have Nicholas Lebiga, who is here tonight, our lecturer in folklore and sound archivist. And of course, we have Alison Sharman, who is our administrator, who's been with us for many years and intimately knows every aspect of the Elphinstone Institute and our work. Often the first point of contact if you get in touch with us. She'll be no doubt the first person you speak to. We also have Simon Gould, who is our public engagement officer, and two very new recruits. Just in the last 2 to 3 weeks, we have Laura Harrington and Kirsty Campbell, who are our NAFCO festival directors, the North Atlantic Fiddle Convention, which is coming back to Aberdeen in 2026. So underpinning everything that we do is the very firm belief that culture matters. And by culture, we don't mean high culture. We're not talking about the ballet or the opera or the theatre. We're talking about culture with a small c. Culture in everyday life, the songs we sing, the music we play, the stories we tell. And in all we do, we're looking to achieve cultural sustainability. We research culture and identity, and in doing so, we seek to build a better understanding of function, meaning, and process. And of course, we celebrate tradition and creativity. And how do we do it? Well, one of the absolute main things that we do is we go out and we conduct field research. We go into communities and we record people's stories. Often this is done in partnership with individuals and community groups. And through this research, we've produced a lot of publications, both in-house and out-of-house, both academic and non-academic. And we have an incredible public event program, and all of the research we do feeds into that. We have an amazing over 60 public events happening this year. Do pick up a public event brochure on your way out. We have regular events such as the public lecture series and the Polish-Scottish singing group and the ethnographic film series. We also have one-off events, and I'll mention a few of those in just a minute. And through all of this, we seek to develop strategic programs looking into the future. And one of the main ones we've been looking at recently and working on is the Scots Language Plan. We also have international connections. We've been building links, particularly with people working in indigenous culture overseas. Tom, as I mentioned, is in Guatemala. He's been working over there off and on for the last couple of years, working with groups in Western Guatemala, and particularly this storyteller here, Pedro. And in my own research, I've spent many times over in James Bay in northern Canada, working with Cree fiddle players and dancers and exploring the historical links through the music with Scotland. Some recent events that have taken place in the last year or so. We had the Alec Green Tin Whistle Festival. It was great to get a chance to celebrate Alex Green's music in this way. Really one of Scotland's most famous whistle players in the tradition. And that was organised by Simon Gould alongside Sarah Reith, who is one of our PhD students and long-term associates. Here she is with Cathal McConnell, who was one of our guests, a number of different workshops and concerts throughout the weekend. Scots language and Doric is absolutely central to many of the things we do, many of the events that take place. One of those is the Toulmin Prize, which has been taking place annually since 2008. And it is run by Alison Sharman, who's been central to the administration of that. One of our publications is this book here of short stories, the prize winners from the Toulmin Prize, Dinner Mess with the Propo. And it's available, if you're interested, it's available to buy through the Institute. We also have a very strong program in terms of storytelling, and Nick Lebiga has been running the Aberdeen and Beyond Storytelling Festival in conjunction with the Scots Storytelling Centre in Edinburgh over the last few years. It's an amazing program. It includes local storytellers and storytellers from further afield, from a number of different cultures and traditions. Here are a couple of storytellers who were booked for events last year. Anna Konomos from Greece and Zahra Afsa from Iran. Another way that we present our research is through exhibitions, and these are a couple that I've curated in recent years. Nimitau, building on my work with Indigenous groups, and the Cree fiddlers in northern Canada, and the shared musical traditions with Scotland through the fur trade, and Shine Spiritual as well. It's actually currently touring, has been since January, and will continue until the end of next year across the Highlands and Islands. And if you're in Benbecula anytime soon, you can go and visit. A celebration of Gaelic spiritual song traditions. And we have digital resources as well. Shine Spiritual also has a digital archive of well over 300 songs that I've recorded in the last few years, as well as a sound map and other resources. And one of our former PhD students, Dr. Fiona Jane Brown, has worked closely with Visit Scotland to produce the North East Cultural Heritage and Tourism Project map. And that can be accessed through the Institute's website. It's got an amazing collection of ballads and stories and crafts and other nuggets from Aberdeen and the northeast of Scotland. So coming up, we have a very large conference of ethnology and folklore, an international conference which is being run by Tom, primarily by Tom McCain, but with all of us here at the Institute next summer in June 2025. There'll be, I think, 700 to 800 delegates of ethnology and folklore and anthropology coming here to Aberdeen. The theme is unwriting, and the call for papers is still current until mid-December. So if you'd like to put in a proposal, do look it up and do put in a proposal for that. We also have the North Atlantic Fiddle Convention returning home to Aberdeen in summer of 2026. So very excited to have that back on home turf again. Next year, 2025, is the 30-year anniversary of the Elphinstone Institute, and there'll be a number of events throughout the year. So watch this space for some celebration events for that anniversary. Now, as well as the public events and the research that we do, we also run a very successful master's program in ethnology and folklore. We have some former students and present students here tonight, so it's great to see you here. If you're interested in becoming a folklorist or just learning about folklore and learning some of the skills involved in doing folklore and ethnology, do speak to either us as staff members or some of the students that are here tonight. It would be great to hear from you. And of course, we also have a PhD program in ethnology and folklore and ethnomusicology. Now, almost all that we do relies on outside funding and support, and we have had generous donations in the past to enable us to do the work that we do. So please do consider supporting us. You can support us in many different ways. One of the ways is by joining the Friends of the Elphinstone Institute. For only £20 a year, you can become a friend and get involved in some of our events and some of our organizations, or just to be part of the Elphinstone Institute community. There are forms at the back that you can fill out if you want to join, or do speak to Alison as well, and she'll let you know how to do that. Now, moving on to David Buchan. David Buchan would have been our first director here of the Elphinstone Institute. Very sadly, he passed away just before taking up the post. He was from the Northeast. He was an eminent scholar, a very well-known and well-respected ballad scholar, and it really was a tragedy that he never was able to take up the position. The Buchan Library at the Institute was established in 1995 in his name. It's an incredible resource for folklore and ethnology publications, and also books and journals and articles about the North and the Northeast of Scotland. And of course, we now have the Buchan Lecture, and delighted to have that back for a 12th year this year. And now I'm really delighted to have Srinivas here, our Dean of International Student Recruitment, to say a few words to introduce Professor Yankah. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thanks so much for inviting me to introduce our speaker for today. Good evening and welcome to the University of Aberdeen. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event. The David Buchan Lecture was established in 2015 to establish the 12th anniversary of the founding of the Elphinstone Institute. The lecture is in memory of the influential scholar who was the Institute's first appointed director. The annual event places ethnology and folklore firmly in the university calendar. This year, our speaker, Professor Kwesi Yankah, has written internationally recognized linguistic and social analysis of African folklore. And he has been deeply involved in higher education, both at administrative and political levels. He was a pro-vice chancellor of the University of Ghana and later president of the Central University until becoming Ghana's Minister of State of Tertiary Education. Professor Yankah is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. His disciplinary background is in folklore studies, and he is a professor of linguistics and oral literature, specializing in the ethnology of communication. Professor Yankah is also an emeritus professor at Ashesi University in Ghana. Tonight, Professor Yankah will speak about folk responses to HIV, AIDS, and COVID-19, and how the Ghanaian government has used folklore in their communications about disease. It promises to be an interesting evening, which we hope will create and strengthen existing cultural and higher education links within the humanities and universities in West Africa, as the Elphinstone Institute continues to support communities in sustaining and regaining confidence in their own local culture. Please join me in welcoming Professor Yankah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Please.
Thank you very much. It's indeed a privilege to be here this evening, invited by the Elphinstone Institute of this great university. Now I'd like to thank the university in general, University of Aberdeen, the Elphinstone Institute, organizers of this project, and the Dean of International Student Recruitment, who just introduced me. I also like to thank the principal, George Boyne, whom I got the opportunity to meet a few days ago, and my very good friend, Michael Lecture from Ghana, who has helped to facilitate my welfare of course, my very good friend Nick was the supreme partner and assistant in everything, who has held my hand from place to place and facilitated my settling in cold Aberdeen, fortunately. Let me say that I'm privileged, particularly also because I'm here in the name of David Buchan. It's an opportunity to speak in his honor. He's an individual I never met personally, but who spent a greater part of his life studying a verbal genre which has local parallels across the globe. The ballad, by a strict definition, could be a close equivalent of the sung tale or sung poem which abounds in Africa. In Ghana, the greatest exponent of this genre is my very good friend, Ejako Nimo, that many Ghanaians know, who is over 90 years and whom I invited almost annually to interact with my students at the University of Ghana. At the University of Ghana, sorry. In 1969, his sung tales, originally in the Akan language, were translated into English and published in a book entitled Ashanti Ballads. This was a collaborative piece of work co-authored by the singer and one J.L. Latham, a British from Lancaster, under whom the singer studied in England. That little publication tells us the art of setting tales to music is universal and seeks to convey the philosophy of life through melody, an intricate blend of wisdom and musical arts. The Ghanaian ballad singer told me his sung tales are a source of multiple delight to him, because singing the Ghanaian ballad with a guitar in hand goes beyond music. He confesses visualizing the acoustic guitar as an ideal female body that deserves careful handling and cuddling, and that to him, the Ghanaian ballad experience propels the entire venture into the world of romance. And I'm sure David would have loved to meet this gentleman. Yet David Buchan does not represent the ballad alone, but any project that examines the dynamics of folk traditions, especially within the whirlwind of modernity and globalization. But I was even more comforted when, on browsing through the list of past speakers in this series, I came across two scholars who were my mates in Indiana within the folklore and ethnomusicology department. I refer respectively to 2017 and 2018 featured speakers, Carl Lindell and Regina Bendix. Regina was a very good friend of mine at Indiana, who in 1998 facilitated my invitation to University of Pennsylvania as visiting professor. Regina and Carl, if you are listening, this is Kwesi's turn to strengthen the bond between Indiana and Aberdeen. Ghana now joins to make this a potent triad. My presentation today, titled Global Health Crisis, Heritage and the Ghanaian Folk, projects a common denominator, the folk, a community of tradition-oriented people within a modern setting. The issue of health crisis, especially with reference to Africa, should arouse considerable interest about a continent that has been paralyzed by crises in the past 400 years. The horrors of slavery, forced migrations, the scramble for Africa, wars, colonialism, killer diseases, epidemic, poverty, illiteracy. Indeed, a stressful cocktail of catastrophes in which the definition of Africa is virtually anchored. Bringing this in sharp focus today amounts to inviting an intellectual excavation of Africa's most tragic moments, which could itself generate an anticlimax of stress at the commemoration of David Buchan. In a sense, we have been a continent in permanent crisis, putting our people on a trajectory of eternal mobility to greener pastures. Stereotypes about Africa are so pronounced that in a Ghanaian community I once visited near San Francisco, children of Ghanaian parents that misbehaved at home could only be called to order if they were threatened by their father with Africa. If you continue misbehaving, I will take you to Africa. I say, Kofi, stop being naughty, or I will take you to Africa. I was spellbound hearing this as a guest coming from Africa myself. But the threat was often grave enough for any child to stop being wayward. Otherwise, Africa could be their destiny. That was dreadful enough to instantly restore good behavior in a family that was of African immigrants. In that context, Africa is not simply another continent. Africa is a penalty unit, the highest custodial sentence invoked on any troublesome child whose parents were African themselves. In your own home, then, you could be sentenced on default to an environment of eternal crisis called Africa. But it's important to situate discourses on crisis within local epistemologies and frame the topic within indigenous ways of speaking to reflect local experience and systems of knowledge production. What is crisis in local terms? Within the largest ethnic group in Ghana, the Akan, the word asem is all-embracing and the subject matter of most of the humanistic disciplines with meanings ranging from word, sentence, things said by word of mouth, or what people say. But asem also has a range of meanings: a matter on hand, an issue, news, urgent matter, depending on the context. At the extreme end of gravity, asem may refer to crisis. Asem wesi, or asem aba, asem atome. These don't convey a neutral sense of event or matter that has transpired, but an aggravated happening or incident needing quick response or contemplation. It denotes a pressing matter crying for quick responses: death, conflict, war, but also natural disaster, earthquake to the extreme. But within the contemporary world of journalism, it could be the journalist's breaking news, if you like. For our purposes, asem could be a calamity, a disease outbreak. Such matters are not matters for storytelling, imaginary storytelling. In all such cases, one can easily say it's asem, a matter of grave significance, or a crisis. Tragedy has caught up on me. Crisis has landed in my household and in the country. In the traditional settings, there was a crisis of state significance. Anytime there's such a crisis, it needed appropriate signaling on drums. The divine drama resorts to emergency signaling, announcing an emergency in peculiar phraseology. Within the traditional setting, it was a communal call to deal with a crisis, an emergency. And if war spells crisis, it is significant that a major crisis could also be triggered by a verbal breach, a violation of laid down verbal taboo that is protected by the royal realm. In extreme cases, cultures may even decide to commemorate major state crises through visual monuments. But have we thought of situations where past calamities are remembered not through material manifestation, but paradoxically through acts of denial, acts of negation, where avoidance rather than physical manifestation is deemed a most appropriate mode of anchoring memory? The translation of this in rhetorical practice is real, considering the significant role that silence and silent spaces play in the preservation of memory and in an integrated theory of communication. In significant moments, communication may cease to be an unbroken sequence of words and sentences. Silence becomes markedly communicative, and avoidance of words may not signal insensitivity, ignorance, or disability, but a strategic verbal retreat, which in a sense may constitute a speech act itself. It is significant that despite its significance for world and local history, slavery does not appear to have left many visible traces in African oral traditions. Were Africans then oblivious to the significance of enslavement? If oral traditions of a people normally reflect a people's culture and experiences, why are there very few traces of slavery in narratives, except a few examples in naming? Is this a case of collective amnesia or a conscious attempt to avoid grief and stress? Is it negative heritage? Remarkably, even though the Akan of Ghana are very sensitive about the past and to the past, they would paradoxically point to a proverb that says, "Wanchere obiase," meaning one does not reveal another's origins. Much as accounts of origin are important, indiscreet investigation of individuals or a people's origins may evoke tragic memories should the past reveal a stigma, such as traces of slave ancestry, that may lead to selective persecution, social exclusion, xenophobia, or needless paranoia. As a people, we may even pause and reflect over our failure or unwillingness all these years to make castles and forts in Africa attractive sites for internal tourism. Why have visits to such important historical sites been marginalized by Africans to become an almost exclusive preserve of foreign tourists who tour the sites as historical monuments commemorative of slave trade? The reason may be simple. We have probably turned our backs on a negative heritage that evokes unspeakable calamities of the past and interrogates our very humanity, a catastrophe that blurs the distinction between our priceless ancestors and market merchandise. But crises in Africa with a long history of trauma have not been considered as entirely new in a people's life experience. Based on wisdom accumulated over the years, societies resort to lay down conventions in response to emergent crises. It is within a people's verbal heritage and traditions that codified responses to crisis are embedded. Even leaders, presidents, politicians in contemporary post-colonial governments have resorted to proverbs and other intangible heritage to deal with contemporary dilemmas. And why proverbs? These are daughters of experience, rhetorical responses based on the wisdom of many and the wit of one. Indeed, proverbs are relevant as long as crises recur. It is often said that there is no matter under the sun that has no precedence. Experience renders every turn of events a déjà vu, not a surprise, nor a completely new development. It is said of the weaver bird, the asrewa, that it looks away when playing games with its young ones because she has seen it all before. In looking away, the weaver bird steps back to objectify experience, consigning it to a known paradigm, couched in a laid-down philosophy of life. The bird simply means this event belongs to a category of dilemmas for which society has fathomed an appropriate response. That is the purpose of proverbs. They are used in the cut and thrust of crisis. There are situations that present suspense, ambiguity, dilemma, uncertainty, or crisis. These are fertile situational cues that lure the proverb in local parlance. Proverbs are lured into crisis to calm troubled waters. and restore social stability in situations of uncertainty. I now draw attention to two major crises of epidemic that have in the past 50 years engulfed Africa, and rhetorical or folk responses these have triggered in Ghana. I refer to the HIV/AIDS pandemic or epidemic that broke out in the mid-1980s and still lingers with much lesser prevalence. But I also touch on the most recent COVID-19 pandemic, which struck worldwide with venom in 2020 and has slowed down since. Stereotyped as the most fertile site for global calamities, Africa was originally fingered and accused as the source of HIV. The virus was originally said to have been first discovered in an African monkey. Unsurprisingly, then was the admission that on humans it was first found on an American. In Ghana, evidence was clear when it reached its peak, with clear symptoms of diarrhea, fever, vomiting, drastic reduction in weight. Ghana's first patient was said to be a German tourist who came to Ghana in 1987. Then was the admission that on humans, it was first found on an American. In Ghana, the evidence was clear when it reached its peak with clear symptoms of diarrhea, fever, vomiting, drastic reduction in weight. And Ghana's first patient was said to be a tourist coming in 1987. But it was soon found among women returning to Ghana from neighboring countries. The global AIDS crisis and the numbers and distribution of those infected worldwide constitute one important issue that should engage the attention of scholars of the spoken word and humanities in general. Relevant matters here include what types of law or discourse the epidemic has generated in localities of high concentration. What are the folk constructions of the disease and its spread? And what are the lay perceptions of risk and vulnerability? What is the expressive behavior involved in all said discourses? The spread of HIV/AIDS by far exceeded our worst fears. Nearly 34 million people worldwide were said to be living with AIDS and HIV at its peak in the mid-1980s. 1/3 of these were young people between the ages of 10 and 24. 14 million people died of the disease, and the death toll kept rising. But Africa appeared to be the hardest hit among all the regions of the world. Between 1985 and 2021, between 340,000 and 530,000, were estimated to have died, the mortality rate having dropped drastically since 2010. Ghana was not one of the most severely hit among African countries, but the figures were equally disturbing. About 3% of the population was early 2000s supposed to be living with the virus, and an estimated 400,000 Ghanaians, aged 15 to 49, were reported to be living with the HIV, not necessarily the AIDS, but the HIV segment. When COVID-AIDS broke in Ghana in 1986, I personally got keenly interested and monitored its dynamics through the early 2000s as a public intellectual, but also as a scholar interested in verbal responses to the crisis. When I started investigating the disease in 1987, there were only 110 reported cases, with more than 4 times the number unreported, according to experts. Fortunately, I had direct access to authorities and the disease carriers themselves through a newly formed technical committee on HIV/AIDS, chaired at the time by Dr. Nikwe, which virtually adopted me as an integral part of the committee. My easy access to patients also had to do with being a PhD holder. Having been introduced to the patients as Dr. Yankah, I was somehow construed as a medical doctor, which bolstered patient confidence in me. This gave me direct access to respective homes in the previous ward of Kolebu, Ghana's biggest hospital, where most of them were confined. I saw horrors of the disease, fleshy bodies reduced to skeletal remains, the forlorn faces of middle-aged men and women, 98% having traveled to neighboring countries, gotten infected, and had opted not to die abroad, but come home to die. Cultural practices believed to contribute to the risk of HIV infection included circumcision and widowhood inheritance. Nevertheless, it was well known that most cases of infection resulted from straightforward heterosexual relations between man and woman. Being deadly, discourse on the disease centered on verbal avoidance, folk constructions of safe sex, verbal autopsies citing supernatural causes, disclaimers or ignorance of HIV/AIDS as a cause of a condition, and stories of patients' final departure. In all cases, there was an underlying element of avoidance or circumvention in discourse based on fear or shame associated with the AIDS stigma. Generally, diseases were distanced and depicted as exotic, and so were carriers of said terminal diseases. Indigenous constructions often characterize carriers of said diseases as having uncommon profiles or features that differ from those of the speaker. As scholars have observed, part of the social process of making up illness is to emphasize differences where anyone who has overt physical and social attributes which are different is socially constructed as more susceptible to illness. Thus, people generally avoided characterizing carriers as sharing features with them. And this was meant to legitimize intragroup behavior and depict the exoteric as deviation. It is not surprising then that at the onset of AIDS, it was largely represented as a disease of the deviant and homosexual other, rather than a disease of the heterosexual self. This was largely due to the early emergence of a risk discourse that included the vilification of those deemed to be at the greatest risk of infection and victim blaming of those already infected. In the Western world, of course, sub-Saharan Africa became one of the stigmatized geographical entities. Safe sex was depicted as not having sex with a different other. Invariably to the pedestrian then, carriers of the disease were the high-class people, and HIV/AIDS could be controlled by avoiding foreigners or tourists who were depicted as potential homosexuals and drug pushers, and prostitutes, particularly those who had practiced prostitution in specified neighboring countries. You were safe from the disease so long as you had sex with familiar people whose travels did not take them to unknown places. And who else would be considered as safe sex partners? Men and women who looked plump and fleshy. The tendency was to avoid potential sex partners who had slim and skinny features. Knowing this, men sometimes avoided the stigma by simply overeating and becoming fleshy or drinking excess beer to acquire potbellies. The construction of safe sex as sex with plump and fleshy features, as sex with plump and fleshy people, derives from the clinical association of HIV/AIDS with physical emaciation or a weak body. But such perceptions of disease carriers were also compatible, if not driven by indigenous African aesthetics, where beauty lay in the plump features of a woman, rather than slimness, typical of Euro-American aesthetics of beauty. Slim looks then were a representation of the deviant other. Safe sex discourse was also informed by cultural anxieties about the open discussion of sexuality, symbolic meanings associated with condom use, and perception of how AIDS is transmitted. Folk perceptions of safe-sex practices included just one-night stands and swapping positions during sexual intercourse. In Ghana, prostitutes sometimes protected themselves from sexually transmitted diseases by wearing protective charms around their waist. At that time, they cured their condition by taking over-the-counter antibiotics, not with ordinary water, but the local hard liquor called akpetesi. Taking antibiotics with hard liquor or strong liquor, it was believed, was the only way to cure sexually transmitted diseases among the prostitutes. Apart from lay perceptions of safe sex, one important attitude in the risk discourse on AIDS was the denial of infection, or the conviction that one's affliction was anything but that particular disease. That's what killed a particular person in verbal autopsies was not AIDS, but tuberculosis, cerebral malaria, or typhoid. Such a claim, however, was not necessarily an aberration, since in clinical terms, the virus only breaks down the body's immune system, rendering its victims vulnerable to other diseases. The avoidance discourse is specifically motivated by connotations of promiscuity, prostitution, and moral deviance that AIDS conjured. This is compounded by superstitious beliefs about illness in general and the ascription of deadly diseases to supernatural causes. In Ghana, the genesis of the avoidance discourse was partly steeped in the early discovery of the disease when medical doctors decided as a policy that it was not appropriate to divulge to HIV/AIDS carriers or their relatives the whole truth about the patient's incurable condition. It was believed that such patients might quietly go on a sex spree and infect as many innocent souls as possible to avoid dying alone. In the following 4 accounts, patients interviewed between 1987 and 2002, or their relations told life stories about the sources of patient condition, sometimes not knowing what disease they had or camouflaging their condition. One patient, Mama, referred to her affliction as an ailment called ahuchir yarba, or stress disease, or stressful disease. The woman who had just returned from a neighboring country with a disease narrated what she really implied by stress associated with the disease. His boyfriend, or her boyfriend from that country, suddenly disappeared soon after she complained of itching in her vagina. And listen to what happened thereafter. I began feeling a burning sensation in my lower abdomen whenever I urinated. It was excruciating pain. Then piles began germinating around my anus. It was very painful. Whenever I went to the bathroom, I screamed for help. Later, a small boil appeared in between my thighs, and I crushed it. That was the beginning of another lease of agony. It began expanding from the friction of my thighs. It became so big and painful that I could only look at it by spreading my thighs wide apart. I was immobile and almost paralyzed, and I could walk only on my 2 knees. I was doing all my household chores on my 2 knees. There was nobody to help. I went to several herbalists, but none could help because I also carried a pregnancy. One herbalist gave me herbs to boil and sit on, but each time I sat on the steam, I felt the fetus turning in my womb. I realized that the baby's life was in danger, so I threw the herbs away. After this terrible experience that lasted for well over 4 months outside Ghana, Mama decided to return to Ghana to die. She delivered the baby at the Kolebu Hospital 5 days before my visit, but for no clear reason, she had been directed by the doctor not to breastfeed the baby and also to refrain from sex. She cried and didn't know why. The woman that was breastfeeding the baby when I entered her real home in Swedru was the patient's sister, who had lost her own baby a few weeks earlier and had volunteered to feed the baby. I looked at the baby more closely, her delicate lips in firm grip of her aunt's dark nipple. At the time I visited, a specimen of the baby's blood was being tested for AIDS at the lab. On my next trip, a week after, Mama broke the bad news that the baby was gone. 3 months after, Mama followed her baby to the ancestors. A few weeks before then, she told me she was going to ask the doctor whether she could have sex when the child was 1 year old. But Mama passed on before her wish could be fulfilled. The second story is that of a man I will refer to as Abeku. He lay quietly on the hospital bed at Kolebu, the nation's biggest hospital. His relatives just visited him and left. He looked weak and emaciated. At the age of 40, his weight was that of a teen, 115 pounds. Under his bed was a waistband for vomiting. And how did it all happen? I avoided mentioning AIDS. I was in a neighboring country, and when the disease started, it attacked my stomach. It was very painful. I couldn't eat. Each time I ate, I had diarrhea. I went to see a doctor, and it stopped for a while, but the diarrhea started again. Abeku went to that country with his wife, leaving behind his children in Ghana. But his wife soon returned to Ghana, leaving him alone. In the absence of his wife, he looked for prostitutes in that country. Soon he himself had to return to Ghana after contracting the disease. Throughout the chat, I had refrained from using the word AIDS to the patient. I have left open the possibility that the patient might not know it was AIDS he had. I was right, but I liked the spirit. For he was confident that he would come back to life. And that day had been particularly happy, a good day for him. He had told his doctor that his vomiting has subsided, and the nurses told him he had gained 6 pounds in weight. Abeku's relations who had visited him had not been told the truth. According to one nurse, we are not supposed to tell the patient or his relatives. That's not our duty. Most of the patients think it's cholera they have because of the vomiting and diarrhea involved. Or take the story of Solo, whose case I monitored in 2002, when AIDS was commonly known in Ghana. He was away in a neighboring country for 20 years and returned to Ghana thin and pale, almost beyond recognition by his own parents. Not long after, he dropped dead, and his father briefly narrated what happened to his son on his return home. He said he was ill for 3 years in that country. According to him, he started coughing endlessly and was sent to the clinic several times. The doctor there told him it was not a dangerous condition, yet he was not able to cure it. He then got hernia, an acute hernia, but he cured it. Even while in Ghana here, he had a deep chronic cough that never ended whenever it started. He sometimes coughed for hours. He was with me on December 27th, 2002, and we watched television together and chatted. He even told me he would go back to that neighboring country after the new year and return later. On December 28th, when I got up and we were ready to cook, I heard some noise from Solo's room. I thought I heard something fall. I rushed there and saw him crouch at the corner. He had apparently fallen and was struggling to prop himself up. He couldn't. In 10 minutes, he was gone. My son was gone. He had told me he lived a high life in his travel, but I suspect his ailment was spiritual. He probably practiced occultism, for you could tell from the power ring on his finger and the fact that throughout the short time he spent with us, he never slept on a soft bed. He opted to sleep on leaves and newspapers and had strange objects in his pocket, like a small bottle of water and a tin of sardine. It looked like ritual food. But I knew he was in his last days. 3 nights before he died, I heard 3 birds cry out in the neighborhood. One was perched on the roof of my building, and one on the wall. Another was in the tree. The birds let out a shrill cry. I rushed to the bedroom and brought out my local shotgun. But it was too late. They had flown away. The birds are death announcers. They are Akpavia crows. This happened 3 days before Solo died. That night he coughed without ceasing and he was breathless. The doctor had told him it was not a dangerous cough, but it was incurable. It has to be spiritual. We buried him on the January 14th. Some supernatural power may have eliminated him. He may have violated certain rules of the sect. It is the sect that killed him. That was the noise I heard. Pa! They struck him. Note that the above incident was in 2002, a time there was intensive education and widespread awareness about HIV/AIDS throughout the country. The cause of AIDS and its mode of transmission were well known almost throughout the country. Yet the old man, a retired school teacher, distances himself from the disease and ascribes his son's fate to supernatural causes. The above story is not different from the last one I'm about to narrate, that of a 42-year-old woman whom I saw reduced to a bare skeleton, somebody I knew. That was in 2000. Since I knew her personally prior to her emaciated condition, I was sure there was something wrong. Her relatives admitted she had symptoms of diarrhea, vomiting, which people normally associated with AIDS. She was virtually on all fours doing household chores and would be cuddled up in her family's sitting room at bedtime. In the morning, she would be propped up and walked to the compound where she would stretch herself underneath a tree. Her 70-year-old mother would not cooperate with me when I asked for a narration of Ya's story. She would rather leave it to God. 2 years before, one of her daughters of 35 had died of AIDS. And why bother to narrate their story over and over? Silence was a story. But I persevered and got a story from Ya's cousins, one of Ya's cousins, who said her departed cousin's story was well known in the family. And he narrated this. She got so ill and grew lean. She was so weak she could not even walk without help. But she said it was not AIDS. Before this, she said she dreamed that somebody, a woman, had given her something like spiritual meat to eat. The disease started 2 days after the dream. She then went to a spiritualist who invited her mother and told her it was a spiritual disease afflicting her daughter. When her mother asked further, the spiritualist said Ya was ill because she had refused to give her mother an amount of money she wanted. Indeed, the spiritualist simply said Ya had been bewitched by her mother. The sick girl was then taken to a hospital 30 miles away. After a few weeks of treatment, she came home. One morning, she virtually crawled to the lorry station with the help of her sister. Minutes later, Ya had been helped to board a vehicle to an unknown destination. In her frail, emaciated condition, it was hard to tell how many days she had ahead of her. She was gone, on a journey of no return. The story of Ya's departure, once again, indicates an attempt to distance the family from the dreaded epidemic. For Ya's mother, the family tragedy For Ya's mother, the family tragedy was unspeakable. Losing two daughters to AIDS was too painful and even shameful to bear. Silence was her story, particularly when she was blamed for her daughter's affliction. To the departed daughter herself, AIDS was a social burden a decent family could not publicly shoulder. If promiscuity was a social stigma, victimization by witchcraft was bound to draw public sympathy and pity. In the final analysis, Ya notices the reality of a terminal condition and the social opprobrium it attracts. She thus seeks solution in a suicidal journey. Much as disease generally reflects an anomaly in the body's functioning, certain diseases, particularly those that foreground the body as a commodified or polluted entity, taint the social standing of individuals or their relations. Thus, not only AIDS was disclaimed, but prostitution was not confessed either. All cases of prostitution admitted were associated with a deviant other. Significantly, equally serious afflictions, namely TB, cholera, appear to be more acceptable decoys or euphemism for victims' condition. And that was only because, even though dangerous, they did not carry the stigma of promiscuity and did not attract blame discourse. In all cases, the self and the familiar were lent greater legitimacy, while the exotic other were depicted as an aberration. The common denominator was the folk management of risk or taboo discourse through avoidance and circumvention. Superstition comes in here to mitigate blame and mark the affliction as beyond the realm of human blemish. Recourse to cultural belief is considered as a subset of the folk rhetoric of avoidance. COVID-19. The more recent COVID-19 pandemic and the devastating impact across the world is another case study. Once again, the global village still made Africa the fall guy, predicting how the pandemic would decimate Africa and spill dead bodies in streets and alleys. Unlike HIV/AIDS, it was associated with promiscuity, yet made primary research possible. COVID-19 partly disabled the foundations of primary inquiries, as well as the very sites that produce data for research. The disease partly impaired the architecture of the humanities as a discipline. Any disease whose control protocols involve constraints on oral production is bound to impact cultural behavior among societies that subsist largely on face-to-face encounters. Here, speech, song, and surrogates that are fundamental modes of human expression become risky undertakings. So is the very act of breathing, which this time had to be constrained by face masks to generate life. If the spoken word was at risk, so was its better discourse. Africa was indeed saved a mass annihilation of its citizens, contrary to early global predictions and expectations. Yet the realities were grim for our pet discipline, the humanities that largely thrive on human ties. Noteworthy was the reversal of normative behavior, avoidance of handshakes, dismantling of interactive forums, the wearing of face masks. Significantly, while the reversal of norms largely prevailed in cities and bigger towns, human interaction in smaller towns and villages knew few or no protocols. The face mask had different interpretations. Whereas it was an attempt to minimize spread of the pandemic, it meant something else in the villages and smaller towns. Since the face mask was largely worn by those coming from cities, it was perceived as a tag that identified carriers of COVID, who should thus be avoided. You were perceived as safe if you had no face mask. If you lived in a village and had not traveled. The message here was a reinforcement of trends earlier discussed under HIV/AIDS. Those liable to infection were the exotic other, the different who have lived elite lives in the cities. The gravity of COVID-19 led to a blend of responses from medical to weekly updates and state-prescribed protocols. Significantly, these were reinforced by a rare resort to the rhetoric of heritage over the 18-month period that the crisis lasted. A presidential week broadcast on the health of the nation compelled listening throughout the country and gave the president opportunities to educate citizens about the latest state protocols prescribed to contain the spread. Significantly, entire state response was simplified through a resort to proverb-laden wax print, whose rhetoric responded with the shifting moods of the nation. The use of the fabric design to praise heroes and commemorate events is well known in parts of Africa and has been documented. So is the use of garment to assert social identities and convey opinion or argument. Here, rhetoric does not solely subsist on the spoken word, but also as clothing and bodily adornment. This is the overarching tradition into which Ghana's leadership tapped, using the language of contemporary wax print in shirt wear to assert or reinforce state policy where possible, but also to depict the national mood and sentiments. The president's second term, from the beginning of 2021, was inaugurated in the middle of a health crisis, COVID-19, which cast a gloom on the nation and the rest of the world. It considerably destabilized a peaceful country like Ghana that had been spared major epidemic outbreaks, wars, and civil strife since independence. Yet COVID-19 affliction of 171,000 and over included 2,000 health workers, a death toll of 1,462, including celebrities, were enough to destabilize the nation. A good number of government officials were afflicted, including the Minister for Health, and the President himself had to be quickly quarantined when there was a COVID outbreak at the seat of government. From early 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic broke, the President had to give frequent updates and policy directives in the nationwide radio and television broadcast, specifically on Sunday evenings. The mood of the nation was clearly reflected in the President's gloomy countenance in his weekly updates. By mid-May 2021, President Akufo-Addo had indeed given the 30th in the series. The gravity of the crisis, rate of COVID infection, death toll, job losses, and severe impact on the economy triggered a solemn national mood that was bound to impact the national broadcast and dictate the president's composure and demeanor. His entire speech register over the period could be characterized as crisis discourse, marked by a demeanor of grief, anguish, and frustration. The national mood was aptly depicted by the president also in the language and symbolism of the fabric wear, which changed in tone with the times. The unstable national moods were appropriately depicted through a kaleidoscope of fabric motifs that meticulously responded to every shift in the mood and health of the nation. While some of the designs were replicas of pre-existing types, a few were readaptations, but most were newly created designs by textile manufacturers who saw in the crisis an opportunity to reinvent tradition and, where necessary, inaugurate new motifs. Invariably, though, every single motif had a memorable name, either depicting a proverb, a phrase, or a verbal formula associated with the presidential broadcast. Fellow Ghanaians, that was the first category of motifs, simply representing the regular opening greetings in the presidential broadcast. Fellow Ghanaians, this is a motif that simply commemorates the typical opening greetings by the president that Ghanaians got used to. It was also an attempt to replicate the rhetorical hallmarks of the presidency. Note the interspersed white and red inserts that capture his signature round goggles, which have become fashionable among the youth. The design simply implies that fellow Ghanaian salutation is the rhetorical signature of the President Nana Akufo-Addo. Others could simply be described as crisis motifs, either directly or indirectly signaling stress, trauma, or anxiety. Inisua is the next one. That was one such fabric, teardrops, which the president wore to give a solemn broadcast. This was a suitable response to a major spike in the pandemic, as announced by the president. It was a stressful situation that would draw tears from a helpless leader battling the odds. It was in one of those tearful moods that the president blurted out one of his most famous laments. In his words, "We know how to bring the economy back to life. What we don't know is how to bring back the dead." Another design was rather blunt and a direct portrayal of the deadly virus. Note the distressed look of the president in this other one coming. It's simply called coronavirus. Any fabric that directly depicts the deadly virus or images that are openly reminiscent of past calamities would normally be avoided in order not to offend sensibilities. Where those fabrics are acquired, they would mostly be kept and used as souvenirs and for purposes of education and future reference. Several African cultures regulate open references to certain categories of catastrophe and would exercise restraint in their recall for fear of their recurrence or hurting sensibilities of loved ones. The use of the coronavirus fabric by the president here was meant to be a shock therapy to vividly convey the grim realities as well as tragic consequences of non-compliance with laid down protocols. Significantly, the coronavirus motif was mildly patronized by the general population and occasionally worn at funeral observances for victims of the deadly virus. As an example here, this was a funeral of somebody who died from AIDS. Next one, Afibi Sani, the name of this cloth. Some years come with trials. Another fabric, some years come with trials. It's an old motif worn by the president on the 23rd update, soon after he was inaugurated to his second term. To start a new term with a crisis could be a sign of tough times ahead. But such grave crises are not new in life. The proverb implies the society's awareness of such endemic trials and the need for patience and self-control to navigate. Where the feeble would submit to panic, it requires the resilience to endure such crises. Note the president's black face mask signifying grief. The next one, Enibri and Soja. Glowing eyeballs do not spark into flames. This is another crisis motif. meaning a disturbed person may present red or glowing eyeballs, but nonetheless, they do not burst into flames. This image represents square designs interspersed with red spots, representing the inflamed eyes of a disturbed person. This was worn by the president on the 26th update. In the 26th update on COVID-19, when a third wave of the pandemic was in the air and had led to a spike in the infection rate, particularly caused by negligence and non-adherence to laid down protocols, the president is disturbed to the extreme, as his fabric wear depicts, but his flaming eyeballs should not be expected to spark, to reflect intensity. This is how far my anguish can be manifested. In other words are not enough to express my grief. The next one, Ebo Fandadiefa, part iron, part rock, part iron. Ebo Fandadiefa was used in one of the COVID-19 broadcasts by the president, sometimes called Day and Night. The motif within the context used depicts an inevitable dilemma represented by rock on one side and iron on the other. That is very hard to navigate. The situation, like the health crisis on hand, demands prudence to convert crisis into an opportunity, or rather darkness into daybreak. Next one, lockdown. And when a lockdown or gridlock was prescribed and enforced in various cities to slow down the movement and stop the spread, the changing motif imagery naturally adjusted to mark the heightened gloom. The lockdown design presents interlocking wire fencing reinforced with padlocks, and that refers to measures taken to restrict movement at the peak periods of the pandemic. Desperate remedies are needed to deal with severe challenges. Significantly, this motif portrays a crisis situation with inbuilt therapies, signaled by the refreshing greenery in the design. But underlying the president's somber mood was a firm resolve to overcome the crisis by any possible means and restore the country to normalcy. If the series of COVID-related imagery paints a picture of gloom, the following are comforting and present a glimmer of hope and optimism. This too shall pass. When his COVID address would typically start with a greeting fellow Ghanaians, it often ended with a sense of optimism. The closing formula in every set broadcast was, "And this too shall pass," implying no condition is permanent, which points to happier times ahead. The latter closing formula attracted appropriate textile symbolism, which presents a tree with half of its branches dry and wilted, and the other half fresh and green, implying that despair shall soon turn to hope. Note the president's white face mask, glowing with optimism. And the next one in Chemfre, residues of a broken pot. Here, our hope and optimism can be more cryptically conveyed, as in the following motif or triangular fragments of a broken pot, which is an old Edinkra motif recalled to help cope with an ongoing crisis. The image presents a difficulty that can be resolved with patient deliberation. A broken pot presents a difficulty on hand, broken fragments, a virtual crisis beyond redemption. But it also provides a clue for restoration. It is a symbol of the healing power of experience and echoes the metaphor of a tilted tree that is not falling and can be straightened. Conclusion: the significance of revitalization of fabric wear is its appropriation within the state apparatus to reinforce public policy and image and manage a crisis. It amounted to a collective resort to past remedies to resolve contemporary crisis and demonstrate the power of heritage as an armor and a shield. But this was not a mere recall of static heritage for contemporary uses. It meant a creative adaptation of symbols, as well as the inauguration of new designs. More importantly, this was not performed to an inert audience. The spontaneous public participation in the heritage dialogue signaled a successful engagement that was also therapeutic. The president's textile dialogue caught on across the country and indeed succeeded in transforming a largely female communicative routine into a non-gendered enterprise, enjoyed and worn by males as well as females. Here, its hallmarks of innuendo, largely filed between women, give way to less combative uses, where the common purpose was to heal wounds. In this lecture, I've attempted to position the concept of crisis in Africa within a Ghanaian context, framing the notion of local epistemologies and relating this to two major epidemics that have engulfed Africa in the past 50 years. I've examined rhetorical and related folk responses that dreadful diseases have elicited and observed commonalities in the rhetoric of denial, avoidance, and local superstition. Running through the raft of responses is the rhetoric of African heritage, which remains the bulwark sprawling across the continent and constantly renewing itself to wipe tears in times of crisis. In today's world, where indigenous cultures stand the risk of being swept away by dominant forms, it is heritage around which the subjugated converge and forge strategies of resistance. Heritage comes in ready as therapy and constitutes the most resilient mode of coping with contemporary crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Yankah, for that incredibly thought-provoking insight into some of that creativity and cultural expression during two incredibly terrible times in terms of medical history of Ghana. Thank you so much. We're going to open the floor to questions. Before we start, I would just have one quick question to ask.